Alright everyone, it's time for the Occult video 149, Satanic Magic Part 3, Satanism as Liberation. I've spoken briefly on this topic before, but I wanted to get more into it as I delete the old sort of Satanism videos that no longer really have relevance because I'm not a Satanist. It's time to remake it according to my newer, more occult beliefs. As opposed to like the atheistic Satanism of my yesteryear half a decade ago, and so that people will stop conflating me with a Satanist and thinking that I'm still one. I still, though, and this is the subject of the video, I maintain that Satanism is essentially a good thing. Not the Church of Satan, necessarily, because that's really just a corporate entity, and I tend not to like sort of the multinational corporate models of the world. And I think they're mostly negative. But Satanism as a core philosophy I see positively. The idea of living at one with nature is definitely there in perhaps a more spiritual and more central way than even within like Wicca, which has its own problems. I should probably make a Wicca series at some point. Probably be a good idea. Differentiate between the different groups there too. There's a difference between like a hedge Wiccan, somebody who belongs to a coven and does sort of the New Age thing with their crystals and so forth. As far as Satanism goes, though, it is essentially a liberation philosophy. LaVey took a book called Might is Right by Ragnar Redbeard, which is one part blood and soil and one part like Ayn Rand proto-libertarian objectivism manifesto, and turned much of this content, some of it's used verbatim in the Satanic Bible, and turned it into a new working philosophy that he happened to agree with. I think that's a good thing. I see no problem with that. That sort of early proto-libertarianism is flawed, but it's much more positive than the way many people live their lives. And what I see as the value of Satanism, its true value, is not as a destination that you're trying to get to. Yes, I have become a Satanist, therefore I'm enlightened. I see it as a sort of cleansing step on the way to going back to other forms of spirituality or anti-spirituality, regardless of where you're born in the world. You were probably indoctrinated from the time that you were born up through your childhood into some movement or another. This can even include hardline atheism. If your parents and your community were secular, were very atheistic, irreligious, you probably have adopted the same beliefs. If they were Christians, you were probably raised up going to church at least sporadically. You probably consider yourself a Christian. If you were raised in Saudi Arabia, you're probably a Muslim. There are exceptions to this, and I see those, by the way, that organically move away from these movements as the true Luciferians, as the cosmic rebels. I see that as a very gifted class of individuals that I have greater respect for than somebody who needs urging in order to deconvert from some religious body or irreligion, honestly. Those are the individuals who have taken initiative to study on their own, and they've almost invariably left behind whatever they were indoctrinated into. The value of Satanism, then, is as a cleansing step to deprogram yourself. I look at it this way. It's sort of evolutionary when you think about it. This ties right in with Might and Right, too, with the sort of social Darwinism aspect of culture, I suppose. A person has been amalgamated. Their conception of reality, especially in a spiritual and political sense, is an amalgamation of old programming software. You can think of the human mind as a computer for this purpose. I think it goes beyond that. I'm not trying to render it to the strictly secular here, but you can think of it that way. It's a good example. Think of it as a computer, and as you're compiling it, you're amassing it together, you're grabbing up all these old programs and sort of pieces of coding from other people who have designed them and slapping them together and getting an end result. It's cumbersome, it's cluttered, it doesn't really work well. When that computer attempts to perform some task, it may not perform at maximum function. Satanism then strips down those layers of bad programming to the most rudimentary core and allows you to purge yourself. What I'm speaking of here is guilt and fear, and I've spoken of this half a dozen times already in other videos. It's time to put it in the occult playlist to replace old outdated material. Most people feel guilty and fearful of things that they shouldn't necessarily need to. That is, you're raised up in religious Christianity, and then it turns out you have homosexual tendencies. You probably feel guilty for that. And you really shouldn't. You also probably feel fear it, because you're afraid of like God's wrath coming down, burning you up in the hellfire forever or something. You smoked pot while being, a member of a congregation that frowns deeply upon psychedelic usage or something. What Satanism does then is it strips it away by saying those are all illusions. They don't actually matter. The core philosophy, I'm not talking about any specific satanic order. I would never suggest someone join the COS. I never joined them. I didn't need to. I became an independent Satanist at the time. I spent a few years purging myself of guilt and fear. I realized most of the things that I was afraid of, I didn't need to fear. They were illusions. They were boogeymen. They were someone's opinion that was garnered into my mind from birth during my childhood. Other people taught me to fear things because they were afraid of them. They learned to be afraid of them from those that came before them, and so on forth, back sometimes into antiquity, or at least into the medieval era. A lot of it is just cultural layers that have been put upon people's minds. Some of it's not even biblical, doesn't even appear there, and yet with that Christendom, from my childhood, especially as I moved through the early teens when I was more religious, those layers of fear associated with my thought processes had been given to me by other people. They weren't the result of my own academic study of any spiritual form, not even just Christianity, let alone all of the others that I could have been studying at the time. When I did begin studying them, I was led to Satanism. I said, well, this seems like a rather free, liberating path, and it was a good thing. As far as guilt, what I had been taught was right and wrong. A lot of that was also just human opinion. Now, there's a difference. When you're using Satanism to purge yourself of guilt or fear, you have to be careful because you do have to bow before the legalism of your culture. If you're, you wouldn't, and you also have to keep in mind there is such a thing as proper guilt and fear. If you harm somebody else, I would call that a proper guilt that you're feeling for having done so. If you're afraid of something that is legit to be afraid of, that's a legit fear. I'm not encouraging anybody to go out and, for instance, go punch a Crip gang member in the head because, I don't want to be afraid of these gangs. Just go beat this dude up. No repercussions. Or I'm going to go wander around in a lightning storm with an iron rod in my hands. I'm going to go into a cave in the woods where there's probably bears. I'm going to have stakes draped over my body. This sounds like a good idea. I need to stop being afraid. Being reckless is not the same thing as purging yourself of false fear. There's a big difference between the two. Or, hey, I'm going to smoke heroin because I don't want to fear addiction or something. But then there's false fear. And morality within society reflects it too. For instance, we say the drug war. In the West, in the United States, we say the drug war. We say drugs. We use one term for all of these substances. Now, the Church of Satan, by the way, isn't even for pot legalization. They oppose all psychedelic usage because people will end up leaving their order. They'll have like spiritual experiences, stop being atheists maybe, or something like that. They'll become religious. They'll become zealots. Be a little problem for their bottom line, I think. I think that's the real reason why LaVey was for that. Also, he hated the dirty hippies. He actually conducted a banishing ritual to get rid of the hippie movement. Seems to have sort of worked, I suppose. Maybe there's something else there in the spiritual mind of LaVey that people now running the Church of Satan don't quite understand. But there's false fear, and then there's legit fear. There's false guilt and legit guilt. You have to bow, but you have to rule your actions with logic. But that logic can't rule your actions when it's shrouded up by layer after layer of cultural material. The cultural morality of our age is often totally wrong. It's also often co-opted by religion. It's also often, it forsakes the religious trappings. It still remains there. It's like a virus. That has altered itself. It's mutated over time, so you don't even necessarily see the religious element. It's like when a bunch of fire and brimstone ministers in the temperance era got together with feminists and made sure that prohibition got passed. It was a bad idea. It played on people's collective fear of alcohol, and it actually made the problem worse. And that's the result that you get. That is a macrocosm of what happens on an individual level in people's lives when they have too much false guilt and fear. It makes them paranoid. It makes them unable to function even in normal society. If you want to unleash your creativity, if you want to be fully your own and decide what you believe in, you have to purge yourself first of the compulsions, the emotional compulsions that prevent you from actually taking a look at what you're afraid of, what you enjoy, in some cases too. You have to strip all that back. I would say, in that sense, religion is a lot like wanton consumerism. A lot of people think they get joy out of purchasing an expensive gadget. They drive an expensive car or something. Is it really giving them joy, or is it sort of just a weird psychological effect, sort of a keeping up with the Joneses thing? I think it's generally the latter. Because I can't imagine that any sane, reasonable individual finds that logical to enjoy. It doesn't make any sense. They spend 1,000 hours working hard so that they can spend 2 hours enjoying themselves. It doesn't make sense. It's almost suicidal. They're destroying their bodies and their minds in the process. And yet many people think that that's perfectly reasonable. I say it's not. I think if they took a really good cold look at it, in a vacuum, if they stepped back out of themselves, they looked at what they enjoyed in life, they looked at what they were afraid of, they looked at what made them feel guilty, they looked at the thoughts and conceptions they have about the spiritual, about even the secular world, they would realize, if they were sort of apart from themselves for a while, how truly ludicrous many of those beliefs are. And that's the goal of Satanism, or should be. Church of Satan aside, the goal of the path is to liberate yourself, to become like Lucifer. In a metaphoric sense, there's no actual Satan down in the bowels of the earth or floating around out in a nebula somewhere, ruling over earth or causing people to do bad things. It's all a Christian invention taken off of Babylonian paganism, essentially. Sort of the Baal worship of the era. Their god is just a tribal Baal, a spirit that they happen to elevate above the others. And then turned into a creator as they encountered religions that had such a conception. They didn't even have that primordial conception until they adopted it from the Babylonians. Until then, it was just a regular routine tribal god. Now billions of people believe in this deity under various names. Rather funny. But if you don't free yourself, then it doesn't matter what spiritual path you belong to. I would say Christians, Muslims, Jews, Hindus, atheists, everybody should attempt to liberate themselves first, to liberate their minds so they can think clearly. If you end up back in that same religious path thereafter, doesn't matter, you're thinking clearly. You can interpret it yourself. You don't need somebody else to interpret it for you. It's a little bit like the revolutionary Christian mindset. As people gain more literacy, and as it's no longer just a bunch of monks and priests who are interpreting the Bible, telling people what to believe. When they begin believing their own things, the human consciousness greatly expands, academia greatly expands, and the world generally, for a while anyway, it gets better. Then they re-corrupt themselves back into guilt and fear with the moralist movements of yesteryear, of the 19th century into the 20th. And then things get even worse thereafter, and they've kept getting worse almost invariably until the rise of the internet. And that's the other counterpart. The internet now makes researching spirituality very easy. You can get any divine dogma that's ever been penned, including some cult materials, is online. You can find it all. It's all there. You can get it in paperback, you can get it as an ebook, you can read it on a website. How wonderful is that? I think that's a taking part in man's overall liberation in the world. And I see that too, spoken on that topic, as a liberating and generally positive thing for the world. That's about all. Peace out.